There are two different knitting techniques that we are going to use to make the blanket squares. The first style is called stranded colourwork, also known as ferrule knitting, and that is how the square on the left has been made. The second style is known as strand tarsia, which is a combination of stranded colourwork and intarsia knitting. The easiest way to show you the difference is if we look at the back of the work. On the back of the stranded colourwork square, you will see that the yarn that's not in use is carried all the way across to the very edges of the work. On the square that's worked using the strand tarsia technique, the yarn actually stops before the edge of the knitting. So we're going to look at the stranded colourwork technique first and the strand tarsia technique second. Stranded colourwork is a style of knitting that uses 2 colours per row. The yarn not in use is stranded across the wrong side of the work. If we have a look at the back of this piece, then we can see how that functions. You'll notice that the yarn is always stranded across in exactly the same way so that it looks very neat. I'm going to show you how to do this now. The reason why it's important to strand your yarn across in exactly the same way all the time is because of something called colour dominance. When you're working stranded colourwork, if the yarn is not stranded evenly across the back of the work, it can make the pattern on the front look uneven. When you are using the stranded colourwork technique, you strand the yarn not in use across the wrong side of the work. The colour that you want to be slightly more dominant, to show out more, is stranded underneath, and the colour that you want to recede into the background is stranded above. At the beginning of every row, I twist my 2 yarns together. And I am currently working row 23 of my chart, which starts with 1 main colour stitch and then 1 contrast colour stitch. So I'm continuing to hold the main colour yarn, and the contrast colour yarn comes from underneath. So the yarn that's in the main colour is staying on top. And now another contrast colour. Now I've got 3 main colour stitches. So I'm not going to take the contrast colour over the main colour, I'm going to take it underneath when I work my next stitch. This technique does take a bit of practice, but what it will mean is that you get a very even result. If you don't strand your yarn consistently, then sometimes the wrong colour will be dominant, and you will find that the front side of the work will be quite unevenly patterned. So I'm going to finish this row, and then I will show you how this works when you're working purl stitches on a wrong side row. I'm now working a wrong side row, and this happens in exactly the same way. I twist my yarns together at the beginning of the row, and then I just always keep the main colour yarn running along the top and the contrast colour yarn running along the bottom. I don't have to worry on this row about looking at my chart, because the colours are exactly the same in this row as they were on the last row. So I can just concentrate on getting my technique exactly right and making sure that the stranding is always consistent. So I'll work to the end of this row, and then I'll show you what that looks like. I've now completed my wrong side row, and if we look at the stitches that are being made, we can see that the white stitches are ever so slightly larger than the green stitches. This is what helps the contrast colour yarn to stand out, and this is why consistent stranding is really important. You can see it all the way along the row. The white stitch is minutely larger than the green stitch. If you find yourself getting in a tangle using this technique, you can try two-handed colourwork instead. And this is where you hold one of the yarns in your left hand and one in your right hand. The yarn in your left hand will be worked using a style of knitting known as Continental Knitting. As usual, I strand the two yarns together at the end of the row. Now I'm holding my main colour in my left hand and my contrast colour in my right hand. This row is also exactly the same in terms of the patterning. So again, I don't need to look at my chart. Continental knitting does take a bit of practice. It's actually the style of knitting that I generally use because I find it easier on my hands. But if you want to try continental knitting, I would strongly advise that you practice on a few plain pieces of knitting before you start using it for two-handed colour work. If you're using two-handed colourwork knitting, it's actually a lot easier to keep the stranding consistent because you're holding your yarns in separate hands. Notice that when I work the white yarn, I always run it underneath the green yarn. So this is my contrast colour and it always goes underneath, not over the green yarn. So I'll work to the end of the row using this technique, and then I'll show you how to do it from the wrong side as well. I'm now working two-handed colourwork from the wrong side, and this row is slightly different from the previous rows, so I need to start looking at my chart again. What's nice about a lot of the rows in the stranded colourwork patterning is that they are actually small repeats across the row, and so you only have to remember the sequence of a few stitches. In this row, all I need to remember is that I have to work two main colour stitches and then one contrast colour stitch, and as long as I work that all the way across the row, I know that I'm on track. Working from the wrong side, it becomes more obvious how the stranding is going, and so it's actually easier when you're on this side of the work to know that you're stranding consistently with the main colour on top and the contrast colour underneath. Now that I've worked a few rows, it becomes more obvious how the colour dominance technique works. You can see that these two white stitches either side of the green stitch are definitely larger and are actually pushing down slightly on the edges of the green stitch, and this allows this nice white pattern to stand out against the green background. If you have any questions about stranded colourwork knitting, please leave them in the comments.